By the early part of the 19th century, the enslavement of people of African descent had become a way of life in the southern United States. In 1808, a law was enacted by Congress that made it illegal to bring any more slaves into the country. However, no one bothered to enforce it. As a result, people taken captive in Africa continued to be shipped to the USA, where they were sold at public slave auctions, so that by the year 1860 there were 4 million people living in slavery in America, and almost all of them worked on the large farms called plantations that were so commonplace across the southern United States. As the American nation began to mature during the first half of the 19th century, the practice of using slave labor had created a great division between the southern states where it thrived and the northern states where slavery had been declared illegal. The warm South had the kind of soil and weather that allowed large-scale agriculture to flourish. As a result, nearly all of the people enslaved in the South lived on big plantations that had at least 20, and quite often hundreds of slaves. And the owners of these plantations successfully used their slaves to generate huge profits for themselves. In contrast, slavery never really caught on in the North. For the most part, northern land couldn't support the kind of large-scale agriculture where the use of slaves actually paid off. In fact, in chilly New England, the poor rocky soil pretty much limited agriculture to small, not very prosperous family farms. Because farming in the North often proved to be a bad way to make a living, increasing numbers of northern farmers took up more reliable work in factories that were becoming a very familiar sight across New England as industrialization took hold. But there were other reasons slavery didn't work in the North. One was that many Northerners had strong Quaker or Puritan backgrounds that made them oppose slavery for religious reasons. Another was that, unlike the South, the North possessed a good number of important institutions of higher education, as well as certain powerful newspapers, both of which actively promoted anti-slavery views, usually for humanitarian reasons. The history of the slave trade goes back thousands of years. For example, in the days of ancient Rome, it was fairly typical for conquering armies to enslave their enemies. Much later in history, after Christopher Columbus reached the West Indies in 1492, colonists from Europe began to raise sugarcane there. The demand for sugar was strong, and at first the Europeans tried to enslave the native people to work on their plantations. But when that approach failed, they started to look to Africa for slaves. This was a logical place to find them, because a well-established slave trade was already in existence there. The slave trade took place along the middle part of Africa's west coast. Africans in this region captured other Africans, often in tribal wars. They put them in chains and held them at slave trading posts along the coast. The captives were sold to white sea captains, packed into cramped ships, and transported across the ocean. In the colonies, they were resold at public auctions to the highest bidder. Slave auctions, such as the one advertised here that took place in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1769, were quite commonplace in America during colonial times. As the colonies grew, several different three-way or triangular trade routes developed to meet the growing demand for slaves. In this example, the route started when ships carrying African slaves sailed to the American colonies, where they were sold for big profits. With the money the ship owners got for the slaves, they could buy American tobacco and bring it to Britain, where it was in great demand. There the tobacco could be traded for British products. After that, to complete the triangular trade route, the British products, often things such as guns and cloth, could be shipped to Africa and traded for more slaves. In this way, slave ships transported 10 to 12 million captive Africans across the Atlantic from the 1500s to the 1800s. Slavery first appeared on American plantations very early in colonial times. Jamestown, Virginia, America's first English colonial settlement, was founded in 1607. Just 12 years later, the first Africans were sold here to work on tobacco plantations. As the smoking habit spread, tobacco became the most valuable export of the colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. As that happened, the number of tobacco plantations increased, and more slaves were imported, so that by 1750, about 200,000 black slaves were living in the English colonies of America. In the colonies of South Carolina and Georgia, most slaves were forced to work in huge flooded fields like this one, where rice was raised, or on plantations where indigo plants were cultivated, from which a valuable blue dye was made. In colonial times, the lands along the northern coast of the Gulf of Mexico, from Texas to Florida, were ruled by Spain or France. In this area, the majority of slaves worked on large sugarcane plantations, similar to those in the West Indies. Cotton, the plant most people associate with slavery, did not become an important crop until well after American independence. The cotton clothing, sheets, and so forth that are so commonplace today were not widely available until after a revolution took place in the way cloth was made. This industrial revolution resulted in the rise of big textile factories and was coupled with a significant increase in the number of slave plantations on which cotton was raised. The changes in cloth making can be traced back to the invention of three important new machines during the last half of the 18th century. The first inventions replaced the spinners, who used spinning wheels to make the thread used for weaving. These devices were water-powered spinning machines like this one, that were capable of rapidly spinning multiple spools of thread from raw fibers. The second invention replaced the weavers who wove thread into cloth on hand looms. These machines were water-powered looms, like the one seen here, that could manufacture rolls of cloth at a high rate of speed. The third invention, called the cotton gin, is what really turned the raising of cotton into a major business. Cotton possesses excellent fibers for cloth making, but they are full of seeds when picked from the plant. Before the invention of the cotton gin, the seeds had to be removed slowly by hand before the fibers could be spun into thread. But using a cotton gin, one person turning a crank could remove as many seeds from raw cotton in a single day as 50 people working by hand. Soon water-powered cotton gins came along that removed seeds even faster. After the new textile machines came into widespread use, cotton consumption increased dramatically in the United States. Cotton even became America's main export as well. And it is amazing to think that a product of such great importance to the nation was produced almost entirely by slave labor. No matter what crops were raised on them, most of the slave plantations of the American South tended to be laid out in a similar fashion, patterned after the grand aristocratic estates of Europe. On a plantation, the owner's home, the mansion house, was always the biggest and most beautiful building. It was usually surrounded by a vast expanse of lawn and well-tended gardens. Adjacent to the mansion house, it was typical to find a much smaller overseer's workplace. This was the combined home and office for the man that oversaw the day-to-day operations of the plantation. The slaves lived in rows of simple cabins like these. Often the slave cabins were built near the driveway to the mansion house, so the owner could impress visitors with his wealth. For slaves were very expensive, and a strong young slave could easily cost over $1,000, which was a great deal of money back then. It has been said that southern plantations were much more like small towns than big farms, because there were so many people living and working in so many different buildings on their grounds. For example, in addition to the numerous buildings in which people lived, there was almost always a separate kitchen building where slaves prepared meals for the owner's family, a smokehouse for making ham and bacon, a schoolhouse where the children of the owner and overseer were taught, an assortment of barns, stables, and gardeners' sheds, several workshops, a grist mill for grinding grain into flour, and many special buildings where slaves processed the crops after they were harvested, such as this sugar house, where sugarcane juice was boiled down, barns where tobacco was dried and packed, and the buildings where cotton was cleaned and baled. The life of a plantation slave was a sad one, of forced labor, poverty, and ongoing humiliation. Under the law, slaves were considered to be the property of the plantation owner, just like his farm animals. If you were a slave, you could be sold at any time and your family torn apart. If the ongoing misery of your life made you want to run away, you knew you would be hunted down and, if caught, brought back to the plantation, where you might be whipped, or forced to wear a slave's collar like this one, that had bells on it, so the owner's men could easily find you if you tried to escape again. In the South, it was illegal for slaves to receive an education, to marry, to vote, to own property, to testify in court, or even to earn their freedom through work. There were two basic types of slaves on plantations. The luckiest were the house slaves, who took care of the owner's house and family, while the field slaves worked in the fields from sunrise to sunset with just one 15-minute break a day. To eat, slaves were given meager rations, mostly of cornmeal, pork, and molasses. And every year slaves received one new set of winter and summer clothes and a new blanket. Most slaves shared their small cabins with 10 to 12 people and slept on straw piled on a dirt floor. And so the lives of the slaves who did the work on plantations were filled with unending hardship, suffering, and poverty, in order that those who enslaved them could enjoy lives of comfort, luxury, and ease.